For 3 minutes inside a quiet Senate hearing room, something snapped. John Kennedy stopped playing along and cornered Kash Patel with a question about Jeffrey Epstein that had no safe answer. Numbers didn't line up. Files stayed hidden. A late-night phone call surfaced. And then came a pause so long it said more than any denial ever could. The room never feels smaller than it does right before something breaks. Late afternoon light leaked through the high windows of the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room, flattening everything into the same dull shade of beige. Staffers checked their phones. Reporters half listened. This was supposed to be routine. Another confirmation hearing. Another afternoon of language that meant nothing to anyone outside Washington. And then John Kennedy leaned forward, cleared his throat, and changed the temperature of the room without raising his voice. He didn't announce it. He didn't build to it. He simply said the name everyone pretends not to hear anymore. Jeffrey Epstein. Not with outrage, not with drama. With the flat tone of a man asking about a missing receipt. You could feel the shift instantly. Pens stopped moving. Heads lifted. The air thickened, the way it does when people realize they're about to witness something they weren't supposed to. Across the table sat Kash Patel, posture straight, expression neutral. The practiced calm of someone who has learned how to say a lot without ever saying the thing that matters. Up to that point, he'd handled the hearing exactly as expected. Cyber threats, foreign interference, broad statements about vigilance and integrity, answers shaped like fog. He looked comfortable, maybe even bored. That comfort vanished the moment Kennedy said the name. The first question wasn't explosive. It didn't need to be. Kennedy asked whether Epstein had killed himself or been killed. Patel answered the way everyone in his position answers now. He said the Bureau's position was that Epstein died by suicide. It landed without impact, like a line everyone has heard so many times it barely registers. Kennedy didn't argue. He didn't push. He let the answer sit there for a beat longer than necessary, long enough for the silence to start working on its own. Then came the follow-up, not an accusation, a timeline question. Were the files related to Epstein going to be released? Patel said they were working through the process. He mentioned coordination with the Department of Justice. He talked about protecting victims, about not releasing irrelevant information into the public sphere. The words were polished, safe, familiar. Kennedy nodded slowly, like someone listening carefully, not because he agreed, but because he wanted every syllable on the record. What Kennedy did next was subtle, and that's why it mattered. He didn't challenge the explanation directly. He asked about quantity. How many documents related to Epstein did the FBI actually have? Patel hesitated just long enough for people to notice. He said it was difficult to quantify. Investigations generate substantial material. Kennedy cut him off gently, almost kindly. He wasn't asking for an essay, just a number. Approximately. Patel glanced sideways toward his attorneys, a reflexive move, quick but visible. He said he couldn't provide an accurate figure without reviewing internal databases. Kennedy leaned forward. The distance between them suddenly felt shorter. He reminded Patel who he was, not with a threat, but with a fact. You're the director of the FBI. You're telling this committee you don't even know roughly how many Epstein files you're sitting on? That's when Kennedy introduced something Patel didn't control. A Freedom of Information Act request, filed months earlier. According to that request, the FBI was withholding roughly 2,300 documents connected to Epstein. Kennedy didn't ask if the number was precise. He asked if it sounded about right. This time, Patel didn't dodge. He nodded. Just once. Barely perceptible, but enough. 90. That was the next number. That's how many documents Patel said had been released publicly, after redactions. Kennedy repeated it out loud. 90 out of 2,300. 4%. He didn't editorialize. He just let the math do the work. Then he asked what was in the other 96%. Patel defaulted back to the language of institutions, sensitive information, national security, privacy interests, ongoing matters. Kennedy stopped him again, the way you stop someone who's reciting a script you've already memorized. Epstein was dead. Ghislaine Maxwell was in prison. The main investigation was closed. So what exactly was ongoing? Patel shifted in his chair. It was the first time he'd moved that much since the questioning began. He used the phrase, ancillary matters, a phrase that sounds important until you try to define it. Kennedy smiled then, but not warmly. It was the smile of someone who knows exactly where he's going. He described himself as a simple country lawyer, someone who practiced law long before he ever stepped into a Senate hearing room. He asked Patel to help him understand. If the central case was finished, who were these remaining concerns protecting? Patel said he couldn't discuss specifics in an open setting. Kennedy accepted that answer, or at least pretended to. Then he pivoted, not away from the issue, but deeper into it. Since Patel had taken over as director, how many Epstein-related documents had been reclassified from releasable to restricted? Patel said he wasn't aware of any systematic reclassification. The phrasing was careful, narrow, technically defensible. Kennedy reached for a folder he hadn't opened yet. Blue cover, thick. He explained that it contained an internal FBI memo dated shortly after Patel took office. The memo stated that dozens of documents previously cleared for potential release had been redesignated as law enforcement sensitive and removed from the release queue. 47 documents. Kennedy didn't speculate about their contents. He asked one question: why? Patel said the decisions were based on updated risk assessments. Kennedy pushed again, calmly. These files had already been reviewed. By career agents, by DOJ lawyers, by classification specialists. They had passed every gate. Then Patel arrived, and suddenly they were too dangerous for public eyes. What changed? Patel talked about methodology, about evolving standards, about consultation. Kennedy interrupted, quieter now, more precise. He asked whether anyone outside the FBI had asked for those documents to be reclassified. Not suggested, not advised, asked. Patel's answer drifted into generalities about interagency coordination. Kennedy narrowed it further. Had anyone from the White House communicated with him about the Epstein files? Patel didn't say no. Kennedy noticed. He pressed again. Had anyone connected to Donald Trump contacted him about restricting access to those files? The room went still. Patel's face tightened. He said his decisions were based solely on his assessment of law enforcement interests. Kennedy pointed out, correctly, that this still wasn't an answer to the question he asked. Yes or no? Patel said he would need to review his communications logs. Kennedy reacted the way only someone deeply confident in their position can react, with disbelief that sounded almost amused. He said he could remember every conversation he'd had about Epstein in the last year. It wasn't casual water-cooler talk. Patel tried again to retreat into procedural language. That's when Kennedy stood up. Not theatrically, not angrily, just enough to reset the power dynamic in the room. He introduced another document, a phone log, a call from Patel's personal cell phone, placed late at night to a New York law firm. 17 minutes long. The firm represented Donald Trump. The call occurred weeks after Patel took office, 2 days before those 47 documents were reclassified. Kennedy set the paper down and asked the question again. Slowly, clearly. Did anyone connected to Donald Trump ask you to bury the Epstein files? Patel tried to explain the call away as unrelated. Kennedy stopped him. He didn't accuse. He laid out facts. A timeline. A coincidence that required more faith than most Americans have left. He used a Louisiana saying about ducks and chickens, not as a joke, but as a warning. Then he asked the final question. Not about process, not about policy, about existence. Were there documents in the Epstein files that directly implicated Donald Trump in criminal activity? Patel didn't answer. He said he couldn't comment on classified materials. Kennedy clarified. He wasn't asking for details, just whether such documents existed, yes or no. Patel declined to answer, and in that refusal, the hearing crossed a line it could not uncross. The hearing technically moved on after that. Other senators took their turns. Questions about counterterrorism budgets, staffing shortages, foreign threats. The kind of exchanges that normally fill C-SPAN footage nobody ever watches twice. But the room never really reset. You could feel it in the way people kept glancing back toward the witness table, as if something unfinished was still sitting there, heavy and unresolved. Kash Patel stayed composed on the surface, but the stillness was different now. This wasn't the relaxed stillness from earlier, when the answers had been easy and the stakes abstract. This was the kind that comes after a door closes behind you, and you realize there may not be another exit. His hands stayed flat on the table, his eyes fixed forward. He barely blinked. Across from him, John Kennedy didn't gloat. He didn't push further. That alone told you something. Kennedy had already gotten what he wanted, and it wasn't a confession. It was the shape of the silence Patel had left behind. In Washington, silence isn't empty. It's a signal. Reporters in the back row were no longer pretending to multitask. Phones were out, not to scroll, but to clip, to timestamp, to replay the moment where Patel declined to deny the existence of documents connecting Donald Trump to Jeffrey Epstein. That refusal would be dissected frame by frame before the hearing adjourned. Everyone in the room knew it. Patel knew it too. There's a reason Senate hearings are designed the way they are. The language is slow. The procedures are rigid. The format is supposed to drain urgency out of everything. But every so often, something cuts through that machinery. And when it does, the contrast is jarring. Kennedy hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't accused Patel of anything directly. He had simply asked questions that forced Patel to either deny something clearly or refuse to do so. Patel chose refusal. That choice mattered more than any hypothetical answer ever could. When the gavel finally came down and the session recessed, the room exhaled. People stood up too quickly. Chairs scraped. Conversations started in low, urgent tones. Staffers clustered around Kennedy. Others gravitated toward Patel's table, where his attorneys immediately closed ranks, forming a human barrier between him and the press. No one asked Patel whether Trump was implicated. They didn't need to. The question had already been asked under oath. The answer had already not been given. Within minutes, clips were moving. The timeline was irresistible. The FOIA request, the 300 documents, 300 towers, the 90 releases, the 47 files cleared and then quietly pulled back. The late-night phone call. Each fact on its own could be explained away. Bureaucracy is built on explanations, but lined up the way Kennedy had lined them up, they formed something else. Not proof. A pattern. And patterns are dangerous in Washington because they invite people to connect dots for themselves. Back in FBI headquarters, the hearing was already being watched in conference rooms and offices where no one spoke out loud. The question wasn't whether Patel had said something wrong. It was whether he had failed to say the one thing that might have stopped the momentum. A simple no. A denial. Something clean and unequivocal. He hadn't done that. Instead, he had leaned on classification, on process, on the idea that some information is simply too sensitive for public consumption. That argument usually works. It's the shield institutions reach for when transparency threatens to get uncomfortable. But in this case, the shield looked less like protection and more like avoidance. Because Epstein is not an abstract case. He is not a live investigation. He is a closed chapter that refuses to stay closed. Every time his name surfaces, it drags with it the same unresolved questions. Who knew? Who participated? Who was protected? And most importantly, who decided what the public would never see? Kennedy understood that dynamic. That's why he didn't argue about Epstein's death. He didn't debate conspiracy theories. He focused on paperwork, on classification stamps, on release cues and internal memos. Those are harder to dismiss as speculation. They live on servers, in filing systems, in logs. And logs, as Kennedy demonstrated, have a habit of remembering things people claim to forget. The phone call was the pivot point, not because it proved anything, but because it changed the burden. Until that moment, Patel could frame his answers as institutional caution. After the phone log came out, the conversation shifted. Now there was a coincidence that needed explaining, and Patel's explanations never quite landed. He said the call was unrelated. He didn't say with whom he spoke. He didn't say why it happened late at night. He didn't say what subject required 17 uninterrupted minutes. Each omission added weight to the next. And then there was the timing. 2 days after the call, 47 documents disappeared from the release pipeline. Not shredded, not destroyed, just reclassified, reburied under a different label. Law enforcement sensitive. A phrase so broad it can mean almost anything, which is precisely why it's so useful. That's where the story stops being about Epstein and starts being about power. Because the question Kennedy left hanging wasn't really about Trump alone. It was about whether the FBI, intentionally or not, was acting as a gatekeeper for political damage. About whether decisions that affect public trust were being shaped by private conversations no one else was allowed to hear. Patel's refusal to answer the final question didn't resolve that concern. It amplified it. Later that evening, analysts would debate whether Patel had technically perjured himself. Most would conclude he hadn't. He'd been careful. Too careful. He hadn't lied. He'd declined. That distinction matters legally, but politically, it often reads the same way. What viewers saw wasn't a man caught in a lie. They saw a man boxed in by his own caution. Someone who knew that any clear answer would close doors he wanted to keep open. And in that hesitation, people saw exactly what Kennedy wanted them to see. Uncertainty at the center of an institution that depends on confidence. By the time the major networks ran the clip, the framing was already set. Kennedy hadn't accused Patel of protecting Trump. He hadn't needed to. He had simply made it impossible to ignore the sequence of events. The public could decide for itself whether it believed the explanations offered. And that's the part institutions fear most. Because once people start asking why certain documents remain hidden, the conversation no longer belongs to the people in the room. It spreads. It mutates. It finds audiences who don't care about procedural nuance or classification doctrine. Audiences who hear refusal and interpret it as fear. As the footage replayed, one detail kept surfacing in commentary. Not the numbers. Not even the phone call. The pause. That stretch of time after Kennedy asked his final yes or no question, when Patel pressed his hands into the table and chose silence over denial. It was a small moment, but it lingered. And in Washington, lingering moments have consequences. Because now the Epstein files weren't just classified. They were contested. And once something becomes contested, it rarely stays buried for long. By the next morning, the hearing no longer belonged to the Senate. It belonged to the Internet. Clips of the exchange ran on a loop, stripped of context, and then reassembled into something sharper. Commentators slowed down the footage, froze frames, zoomed in on facial expressions that normally disappear into the background noise of government proceedings. The story wasn't what was said. It was what wasn't. Inside FBI headquarters, the mood had shifted from irritation to containment. This wasn't the first time Epstein's name had caused discomfort, but this was different. This time, the discomfort had a face, a timestamp, and a paper trail. The agency's instinct, honed over decades, was to close ranks. Say less. Say nothing new. Let the news cycle burn itself out. But cycles don't burn out when there's a vacuum. The problem with withholding information is that it doesn't create silence. It creates speculation. And speculation doesn't care about classification markings or internal review processes. It feeds on gaps. The Epstein files were nothing but gaps. Reporters started asking the same questions Kennedy had asked, but without the constraints of Senate decorum. Why were 2,300 documents still being withheld years after Epstein's death? Why had dozens of files already cleared for release suddenly been pulled back? Why now? The FBI issued a brief statement reiterating its commitment to protecting victims and ongoing law enforcement interests. It didn't mention the phone call. It didn't mention the memo. It didn't mention Trump. That omission was noticed. What made the situation harder to control was that no new allegation needed to be introduced. Everything driving the conversation already existed in the public record. FOIA numbers, internal memos, a call log. Kennedy hadn't alleged a crime. He'd laid out a sequence. The sequence spoke for itself. Inside the Beltway, former prosecutors and intelligence officials began choosing their words carefully. On cable panels, they explained that refusing to answer a question under oath isn't the same as admitting something. They were right. But they also acknowledged, sometimes reluctantly, that public trust doesn't operate on legal distinctions. Trust erodes when institutions appear to protect themselves rather than inform the people they serve. And that perception was spreading. The Epstein case has always functioned like a mirror. Everyone who looks into it sees something different, but no one sees clarity. The lack of transparency has allowed every faction to project its own suspicions onto the same dark surface. Kennedy didn't change that dynamic. He exploited it. By forcing the FBI director into a position where clarity was possible but not chosen, he reinforced the idea that something was being withheld, not because it was dangerous, but because it was inconvenient. That idea is corrosive. For Patel, the damage wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about credibility. He had entered the hearing with institutional authority and left it with questions hanging over his leadership. His defenders pointed out that classification decisions are complex, that releasing sensitive information can re-traumatize victims. That caution is a virtue in law enforcement. All of that may be true, but none of it explained the timing. Timing is what people fixate on when explanations fall short. 2 days between a late-night call and a reclassification decision is not evidence. It is, however, proximity. and proximity invites inference. Patel had offered no alternative narrative that could compete with the one Kennedy had implicitly constructed. Without that counter-narrative, the vacuum filled itself. Behind closed doors, lawmakers began discussing next steps. Some talked about additional hearings. Others floated the idea of subpoenaing the reclassified documents for in-camera review. Quiet conversations started about whether the FBI's handling of Epstein materials required independent oversight. Nothing official, not yet. But the machinery had started moving. What made the situation volatile was that it touched a nerve far beyond partisan lines. Epstein's network intersected with wealth, power, and privilege in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. The public had watched one of the most notorious criminal cases of the century end without answers. No trial, no full accounting. Just a death in a cell and a promise that justice had been served. Kennedy's questioning reopened that wound. It reminded people that closure had been declared, not achieved. Patel's refusal to deny the existence of incriminating documents wasn't just about Trump. It suggested that the FBI had become the final arbiter of which truths were safe enough to release. That's a dangerous position for any institution in a democracy, especially one that relies on public confidence to function. And confidence, once shaken, is hard to restore. As the story spread, something else happened. Former Epstein associates, previously content to stay quiet, began to resurface in reporting. Not because they had new information, but because the renewed attention made old connections newsworthy again. Names that had faded returned to headlines. The past, carefully buried under procedural language, started to feel unfinished. That's the risk of half-transparency. It doesn't satisfy curiosity. It provokes it. Kennedy understood that too. In follow-up interviews, he didn't escalate his rhetoric. He didn't accuse Patel of corruption. He repeated the same point calmly. The American people deserve answers, and silence breeds suspicion. By staying measured, he avoided overplaying his hand. The more restrained he was, the louder the unanswered questions became. Meanwhile, Patel avoided the cameras. When pressed, his office reiterated the same talking points: national security, victim protection, legal constraints, no comment on classified materials. Each repetition dulled the words further, turning them into background noise against the growing demand for clarity. The irony was that the FBI could have contained the damage early. A clear denial, if truthful, would have reset the conversation. A transparent explanation for the reclassification decisions might have slowed the momentum. Instead, every non-answer became another data point in the story people were telling themselves. That story wasn't about Epstein anymore. It was about whether powerful institutions answer to the public or to the people they quietly consult behind closed doors. As days passed, the hearing became a reference point. Analysts called it a turning moment, not because it revealed new facts, but because it reframed old ones. It showed how fragile trust becomes when accountability feels conditional, and it left one question unresolved, hanging over everything that followed. If there was nothing to hide, why did hiding seem to come so naturally? By the time the next hearing date was whispered about, the damage had already been done. The Epstein files were no longer just classified documents. They were symbols of secrecy, of discretion exercised without explanation, of answers deferred indefinitely. In Washington, symbols have power. They shape narratives. They outlast statements. And as Patel prepared for whatever came next, one thing was clear. The silence he chose in that room had given the story a life of its own. By the end of the week, the question wasn't whether the Epstein files would be released. It was whether anyone still believed they ever would be. What had begun as a narrow exchange in a Senate hearing had expanded into something broader and more uncomfortable, a referendum on how power manages its own exposure. The documents themselves were almost beside the point now. What mattered was who controlled them, and why that control seemed to tighten precisely when scrutiny increased. Inside Congress, the mood shifted from curiosity to calculation. Lawmakers who had watched the exchange quietly began asking their staff what leverage actually existed. Subpoenas were mentioned in low voices. So were closed-door reviews and special counsels. No one moved publicly. Not yet. But the idea that the matter could simply be ignored had evaporated. Once a refusal is seen, it can't be unseen. For John Kennedy, the moment had already served its purpose. He didn't embark on a media tour declaring victory. He didn't dramatize the outcome. In interviews, he repeated the same restrained line. He had asked questions on behalf of the American people, and the answers spoke for themselves. That restraint was strategic. The more he said, the more he risked turning a structural issue into a personal feud. By stepping back, he let the unanswered questions linger without interference. For Kash Patel, the calculus was different. Silence had protected him in the hearing room, but outside it, silence became a liability. Every day without clarification allowed speculation to harden into assumption. His defenders argued that the FBI does not litigate sensitive matters in public. His critics countered that public trust isn't sustained by procedural correctness alone. It's sustained by confidence that institutions aren't selectively opaque. That confidence was fraying. The Epstein case had always occupied a strange space in the public consciousness. It wasn't just about one man's crimes. It was about proximity, about how many powerful figures had orbited the same social circles without consequence. When Epstein died, the narrative froze mid-sentence. No trial, no full evidentiary airing. The expectation, implicit but strong, was that the government would eventually fill in the blanks. Years passed. The blanks remained. Kennedy's questioning didn't fill them either. It did something more destabilizing. It suggested that the blanks were being preserved intentionally. The reclassified documents became the focal point. 47 files that had cleared every internal hurdle, only to be pulled back under a different label. Patel hadn't explained what new risk had emerged, only that assessments had changed. That explanation might have sufficed in a less charged context. But paired with the timing of the late-night phone call, it felt incomplete. Not wrong, just incomplete. And incompleteness, in politics, is fertile ground. Legal analysts debated whether the FBI director was obligated to answer Kennedy's final question. Most agreed he wasn't. Classification rules are real. Open hearings have limits. But legality wasn't the metric people were using. They were measuring plausibility. And plausibility depends on narrative coherence. The story Patel offered lacked that coherence. It relied too heavily on abstractions and too lightly on specifics. Meanwhile, the name Donald Trump hovered over everything, unspoken but ever present. Kennedy had been careful. He hadn't accused Trump of a crime. He hadn't claimed the documents implicated him. He had simply asked whether such documents existed. Patel's refusal to deny their existence was enough to keep Trump at the center of the conversation without ever being directly placed there. That distinction mattered. It insulated Kennedy from accusations of recklessness while ensuring the question remained alive. Trump's allies dismissed the episode as theater. His critics treated it as confirmation of long-held suspicions. But even among those inclined to defend him, the lack of a clear denial complicated the narrative. If there was nothing there, why not say so? That question echoed far beyond partisan lines. As days turned into a week, pressure mounted for some form of resolution. Calls for transparency grew louder, but they were diffuse, unfocused. No single actor controlled the next move. The FBI could release more documents, but doing so might invite further scrutiny. Congress could escalate, but escalation carries political risk. The White House remained conspicuously distant, issuing no statements, offering no guidance. Distance, too, sends a message. What became clear was that the Epstein files had transformed into a test case, not of guilt, but of governance, of how institutions respond when their internal logic collides with public demand. The FBI's reliance on classification had once been a shield. Now it looked, to many, like a wall. And walls provoke a particular kind of response. In private conversations, even some current and former officials acknowledged the problem. Transparency, they said, isn't binary. But neither is secrecy. The challenge lies in knowing when the balance tips. In the Epstein case, that balance had been tilted for so long that any further withholding felt less like prudence and more like defiance. The irony was that releasing the documents might not have delivered the clarity people expected. Redactions would remain. Context would be disputed. New questions would emerge. But release would have signaled good faith. It would have suggested that the institution trusted the public enough to engage honestly, even if the engagement was messy. By refusing to move, the FBI chose stability over trust. In the short term, that choice protects control. In the long term, it erodes legitimacy. Kennedy understood that too. He ended his public comments not with a demand, but with a reminder. In a democracy, he said, sunlight isn't optional, it's foundational. He didn't specify what should be released or when. He left that decision where it belonged, with the institutions themselves. But the implication was unmistakable. The longer they delayed, the more damaging the eventual reckoning would be. As the story faded from the front page, it didn't disappear. It settled. It became a reference point, something analysts and commentators returned to when discussing trust in federal institutions. The Epstein files, once obscure, now symbolized a broader anxiety about accountability. And symbols endure. Patel would continue his tenure. The FBI would continue its work. The documents would remain classified, at least for now. But the exchange in that hearing room had altered the landscape. It had shown how quickly confidence can unravel when answers are withheld without explanation. How silence, intended as protection, can instead amplify suspicion. The final image most viewers remembered wasn't a document or a statistic. It was a pause. A moment when a yes or no question hung in the air, unanswered. In that pause, people projected their fears, their doubts, their cynicism. The institution on display didn't collapse. It didn't confess. It simply hesitated. And in an era defined by skepticism, hesitation is often interpreted as confirmation. The Epstein files are still buried. The reasons remain officially sound, procedurally justified, legally defensible. But something shifted that afternoon. The burden of proof quietly changed hands. No longer did the public have to prove there was something wrong. The institution had to prove there wasn't. Whether it ever will is a question that remains open. And as long as it does, the story that began with a single name spoken aloud in a quiet hearing room will continue to reverberate, unanswered, in the space between secrecy and trust.